The story does not begin with crowds tearing down statues or flags, sliding down poles. It begins in rooms no one films. Narrow offices, flickering lights, desks stacked with paper. The sound is not cheering, but calculators tapping late into the night. Numbers refuse to line up. Ledgers drift. A line meant to balance simply doesn't. In one corner of the economy, warehouses swell with goods nobody wants. In another, stores sit empty of what people need to live. This is not drama. This is decay. Slow, quiet, invisible to the world outside. Yet this is where the Soviet system begins to fail. Not on television, not in speeches, but inside the machinery that was supposed to make daily life work. We are taught that the system collapsed because belief collapsed, because ideology ran out of fuel, because leaders lost control. Those explanations are clean and comforting. They fit on a page. They fit into headlines. But they missed the deeper break. The Soviet system did not snap because people stopped believing first. It snapped because money stopped working as a tool of power. Prices stopped telling the truth. Wages stopped meaning what they promised. Production stopped responding to demand. The system was designed to command reality. It set prices. It set wages. It planned output years in advance. For decades, that command seemed absolute. Then reality pushed back. And it pushed harder every year. For a long time, the state promised certainty. Not comfort. Certainty. A job would exist tomorrow. Bread would cost what it cost yesterday. Rent would not rise. Fuel would arrive. The future would not surprise you. That promise mattered more than abundance. It created stability across enormous distances and countless communities. It bound cities and villages into a single rhythm. Across 11 time zones, people woke to the same expectations. Work would be there. Money would work. Tomorrow would resemble today. That promise held the system together more than fear ever could. When that promise cracked, the system lost its spine. Imagine a superpower that could launch rockets into orbit, but could not decide what bread was worth. Think about that. Bread is simple. It is daily. It is universal. Yet, pricing it honestly meant admitting scarcity. It meant admitting cost. It meant admitting trade-offs. The system avoided that admission. Prices became political decisions, not economic signals. They were frozen, adjusted quietly, or subsidized into fiction. The result looked stable on the surface. Underneath, it rotted. When prices lie, they don't disappear. They migrate. They reappear as shortages, queues, favors, and black markets. They reappear as wasted labor and misdirected resources. Over time, lies compound. Money is not just paper. It is a language. It tells producers what to make. It tells workers what their time is worth. It tells planners where resources are scarce. When that language breaks, coordination breaks with it. In the Soviet system, money lost its voice. Wages arrived, but they could not always buy. Savings existed, but they did not always store value. Bonuses rewarded targets, not usefulness. Factories met quotas that no one needed. Goods were shipped because plans required shipping, not because demand existed. The economy kept moving, but it no longer knew where it was going. Authority depends on predictability, not perfection. Predictability. People tolerate hardship if they trust the system to function tomorrow. They endure shortages if they believe relief will come. They follow rules if rules produce results. The Soviet state understood this. That is why it protected the promise of stability so fiercely. That is also why the breakdown was so dangerous. Once daily life became uncertain, belief began to leak away, not in speeches, in kitchens, in lines, in whispered jokes, in the quiet calculation of whether the system still worked. The breakdown did not announce itself. There was no single moment when the economy failed. Instead, there were thousands of small failures. Deliveries that arrived late, supplies that arrived wrong, paychecks that arrived on time but bought less, plans that looked perfect on paper and collapsed in practice. Each failure could be explained away. Temporary disruption, transport error, local mismanagement. But together, they formed a pattern. The pattern said something the system could not admit. Control on paper was no longer control in reality. This is a story about leverage, not slogans. About incentives, not speeches. The Soviet economy relied on commands rather than signals. Orders replaced prices. Targets replaced profit. Compliance replaced competition. This worked as long as the system could absorb mistakes. And it did. Losses were hidden inside the state. Inefficiency was spread across the population. Scarcity was rationed. The pain was real, but it was managed. Over time, however, the mistakes grew larger. The absorption capacity shrank. The system began to feel heavy, slow, brittle. Think about a factory told to produce a certain number of machines. Not good machines. Not useful machines. A number. It meets the target. The plan is satisfied. The machine is counted. But the machine breaks. Or no one needs it. The cost does not disappear. It shows up somewhere else. In repairs. In storage. In shortages of parts that could have been used better. Multiply that across an entire economy. Multiply it across decades. The waste becomes structural. The waste becomes normal. The waste becomes invisible. Until it isn't. Trust is the most fragile resource in any system. It takes years to build and moments to lose. In the Soviet case, trust eroded slowly. People adjusted. They traded favors. They hoarded. They planned around the plan. Informal networks grew where formal ones failed. This adaptation kept life going. It also hollowed out the official economy. The state still issued orders. People still complied on paper. Reality operated elsewhere. The gap widened. When a system governs forms instead of outcomes, it eventually governs nothing. The stakes were enormous. This was not a company failing. This was not a market crash contained to one sector. This was a system responsible for food, housing, energy, transport, and employment for millions. Control over daily life rested on the belief that the state could deliver. When delivery faltered, authority faltered with it. A government can survive protest. It can survive criticism. It cannot survive irrelevance. When people stop relying on it to solve basic problems, it loses its reason to exist. The Soviet system was designed to eliminate chaos. It aimed to replace uncertainty with planning. It promised to tame the future. But planning without feedback is blind. Without honest prices, planners lacked a compass. They could not see where resources were needed most. They could not see where labor was wasted. They could not see when a policy failed until the consequences spread. By the time adjustments were made, damage was already done. The system responded slowly to fast-moving reality. Each delay made the next adjustment harder. There's a moment in every failing system when effort no longer produces results. People work, but outcomes do not improve. Factories run, but shelves stay empty. Money circulates, but value does not accumulate. That moment is fatal. It tells citizens that obedience no longer pays. It tells managers that compliance no longer matters. It tells the state that commands no longer translate into action. From that point, power becomes performance. Speeches replace solutions. Declarations replace delivery. The system speaks louder because it is no longer heard. This is not a moral story. It is a mechanical one. Systems fail when signals fail, when cause and effect break, when incentives reward the wrong behavior. The Soviet system did not collapse because it lacked intelligence or effort. It collapsed because it distorted information at every level. Prices were smoothed to avoid pain. Losses were hidden to avoid blame. Shortages were denied to preserve confidence. For much of the 20th century, the Soviet system looked unbreakable. From the air, it appeared as a machine built at continental scale. Rail lines stitched forests to factories. Smoke rose from steel mills that never slept. Entire cities were drawn onto maps before the ground was even cleared. Streets, housing blocks, power plants, schools, all planned as a single motion. It was not messy growth. It was deliberate construction. To many observers, this looked like mastery. A society that could design itself from the top down. A system that replaced chance with control. Central planning promised something radical. It claimed to end the cycle of booms and busts. No sudden crashes. No unemployment spikes. No factories closing overnight. The state would set prices, allocate resources, and absorb losses quietly. If a factory failed, it would not collapse. It would be supported. If demand shifted, the plan would be adjusted. In theory, chaos had been engineered out. In practice, chaos was hidden. But for a long time, the appearance of order was enough. Factories did not compete. They complied. Targets replaced profit as the measure of success. A manager's job was not to satisfy customers, but to satisfy the plan. Hitting the number mattered more than how the number was hit. Quantity mattered more than quality. Wages were stable. Employment was guaranteed. People did not fear losing their jobs. They feared being reassigned. This created a sense of security that markets could not offer. Predictability became the system's greatest selling point. Think about what that meant in daily life. You might not have much choice, but you had routine. You might not have abundance, but you had certainty. The rent would not change. The job would still be there. The future would not surprise you. For millions, that stability felt like strength, and it was, in a limited sense, a system that removes fear gains compliance. A system that guarantees survival gains loyalty. At least for a while. Scale amplified the illusion. The territory was vast. The population was large. The resources were immense. Oil, gas, coal, metals, timber. The system sat on top of wealth measured not in money, but in matter. As long as raw materials flowed, the machine could keep running. Exports provided hard currency. Hard currency paid for imports the system could not produce well. The gaps were patched. The wheels kept turning. On paper, the numbers looked impressive. Output rose. Production targets were met. New facilities opened. Statistics flowed upward, polished at every level. Shortages could be explained away as temporary. Quality problems could be ignored. Losses could be absorbed by the state. If everything belongs to the state, nothing ever truly fails. It is simply reclassified. A factory does not go bankrupt. It is reorganized. A project does not collapse. It is delayed. This created a powerful illusion of invincibility. The system appeared immune to the pressures that crippled others. No stock market crashes. No mass layoffs. No visible financial panic. Order reigned. Even inefficiency looked stable. From the outside, it seemed as if the system had solved the problem of modern economies. It had replaced volatility with planning, uncertainty with authority. But this strength depended on one critical condition. The system had to keep moving. It did not need to be efficient. It needed to maintain momentum. As long as production continued, as long as exports flowed, as long as the plan could be adjusted on paper, the illusion held. The system was not designed to stop. It was designed to push forward, absorbing friction rather than resolving it. Ships carried raw materials west. Oil flowed through pipelines. Hard currency returned. That currency mattered more than official money. It paid for technology. It paid for grain. It paid for gaps in the system. As long as those external flows continued, internal distortions could be masked. The system borrowed strength from outside without admitting dependence. That borrowing would later become a weakness. Inside the economy, incentives quietly weakened. When success is defined by compliance, creativity fades. When failure carries no consequence, inefficiency spreads. Workers learned that effort and reward were loosely connected. Managers learned that appearances mattered more than outcomes. The plan rewarded obedience, not innovation. Over time, this reshaped behavior. People did what was required, not what was useful. The system ran, but it ran hollow. Production numbers rose. Quality fell. This was not accidental. Quality was harder to measure. Quantity was easy. Targets were numeric. Inspectors counted units, not satisfaction. A factory could meet its quota by producing goods that technically met specifications but failed in practice. Those goods still counted. They still moved through the system. The cost of failure showed up later, somewhere else, where it was harder to trace. Think about that. If a machine breaks quickly, the factory still gets credit for producing it. The repair burden shifts downstream. Spare parts are consumed. Labor is wasted. Output elsewhere declines. But the original target remains met. The system rewards the wrong outcome and punishes the wrong actor. Multiply that across sectors. The distortion compounds. The state absorbed these distortions for years. It spread the cost across the population. It rationed. It subsidized. It reassigned resources. This prevented collapse. It also prevented correction. Markets punish inefficiency quickly. Planning systems hide it slowly. The Soviet system chose stability over truth. That choice bought time. It also built fragility. The illusion of strength was reinforced by control over information. Statistics were filtered. Bad news softened. Targets adjusted quietly. Problems were framed as local, not systemic. Each layer protected the one above it. The result was a leadership increasingly detached from reality. Decisions were made based on numbers that described intention more than outcome. The system believed its own reports. Cities continued to grow. Infrastructure expanded. The military projected power. From the outside, it looked like permanence. Inside, the system was learning the wrong lessons. It interpreted survival as success. It interpreted continuity as proof. Each year the system did not collapse became evidence that it could not collapse. That belief hardened. But beneath the surface, pressure accumulated. Every absorbed loss was a debt not recorded. Every mispriced good was a signal ignored. Every subsidy delayed a reckoning. The system grew heavier with each compromise. Like a structure reinforced to hide cracks, it looked solid until the load exceeded tolerance. The illusion was not maintained by deception alone. It was maintained by genuine achievement. The system did mobilize resources at scale. It did build rapidly. It did eliminate certain forms of insecurity. These achievements were real. They also masked the cost. Efficiency was traded for control. Flexibility was traded for predictability. Feedback was traded for authority. Think about the trade. A system that cannot hear bad news cannot adjust. A system that punishes deviation cannot learn. The Soviet economy was powerful at executing decisions. It was weak at revising them. When conditions changed, it lagged. When errors accumulated, it buried them. Over time, the gap between plan and reality widened. The system looked unstoppable because it absorbed pressure instead of releasing it. Like a dam holding back water, it appeared strong. But pressure does not disappear. It builds. And when release finally comes, it is sudden. The illusion of strength was not false. It was incomplete. It described the surface, not the structure. By the later years, the machine still hummed, but the sound was different. Less confidence, more strain, more improvisation. The plan still existed, but it was increasingly symbolic. Reality operated around it. The system had not failed yet, but it was no longer correcting itself. It was surviving by inertia. This is the danger of systems that prize stability above truth. The cracks did not appear all at once. They spread the way rust spreads inside steel. Slowly, quietly, out of sight. On the surface, the system still functioned. Trains ran. Factories opened their gates each morning. Paychecks were issued. Plans were published. But beneath that surface, the signals that once coordinated the economy were fading. Prices no longer reflected cost. Output no longer reflected need. Money no longer carried information. It merely moved. At the core of the problem was something simple and fatal. Without real prices, the system lost its compass. Prices are not decorations. They are signals. They tell producers where resources are scarce. They tell consumers what trade-offs exist. When those signals are muted or distorted, decisions drift. In the Soviet system, prices were fixed to preserve stability. That choice removed pain in the short term. It also removed feedback. Factories did not know if what they produced was useful. Planners did not know where shortages were most urgent. Everyone operated in partial darkness. Resources flowed blindly. Energy was consumed because it was available, not because it was needed. Raw materials were allocated according to planned targets, not market demand. Labor was deployed where quotas required, not where productivity was highest. This created a strange economy filled with contradictions. Chronic shortages existed alongside chronic waste. Entire sectors lacked basic inputs, while others drowned in unusable output. The system produced more and delivered less. Think about a warehouse stacked floor, the ceiling with goods no one wanted. Those goods represented labor, energy, and time already spent. They could not be recovered. Meanwhile, across the city, people waited in line for essentials. The mismatch was not accidental. It was structural. Production responded to orders, not outcomes. When outcomes failed, the system blamed distribution, not production. The fix was always more control. Over time, shortages became permanent, not occasional disruptions, but expected features of life. People learned which goods would be scarce and when. They adjusted their behavior accordingly. They hoarded. They traded favors. They planned around absence. Surpluses, when they appeared, were often useless. A factory might exceed its quota by producing items that technically met requirements but failed in practice. The numbers looked good. Reality did not. Oil revenues delayed the reckoning. For years, energy exports provided hard currency that patched internal failures. That currency paid for food imports. It paid for machinery. It paid for time. The system grew dependent on this external support. Instead of fixing inefficiency, it financed it. Think about that. A system designed to be self-sufficient increasingly relied on forces it could not control. When external conditions shifted, the cushion thinned. Revenues fluctuated. Import costs rose. Hard currency became precious. The system faced choices it had long postponed. Cut imports or cut promises. Reduce subsidies or admit scarcity. Neither option was politically safe. So the system did what it had always done. It delayed. It borrowed. It improvised. Debt crept in quietly. Not always as formal borrowing, but as obligations deferred. Maintenance postponed. Infrastructure neglected. Investments delayed. The future was used to pay for the present. Imports grew more expensive relative to exports. Trade balances strained. The system's external position weakened even as internal inefficiency grew. Reforms were attempted. Not bold ones. Cautious ones. Partial ones. Enterprises were told to be more efficient, but not allowed to fail. Managers were given more responsibility, but not real autonomy. Prices were nudged, but not freed. The state wanted efficiency, without surrendering control. That combination is unstable. It exposes contradictions instead of resolving them. Think about being told to swim faster while bound to the shore. Enterprises were expected to respond to demand without the ability to set prices. They were expected to innovate without the freedom to reallocate resources. They were expected to improve quality without changing incentives. The result was paralysis. No one knew which rules mattered anymore. The old ones were failing. The new ones were incomplete. Money, once the silent organizer of daily life, stopped coordinating behavior. Wages arrived, but they did not guarantee access. Savings accumulated, but they did not guarantee security. Bonuses existed, but they rewarded compliance, not usefulness. When money loses credibility, people seek alternatives. Barter expanded. Informal exchange grew. Personal networks replaced official channels. The formal economy shrank even as it appeared unchanged on paper. Lines grew longer, not just for goods, but for answers. People waited without knowing what would arrive or when. Waiting became work. Time was consumed without producing value. Productivity suffered. Morale followed. Think about that. An economy where hours are spent standing still. The cost is enormous, but it does not appear in official accounts. Black markets fill gaps official channels could not. They did not emerge because people were immoral. They emerged because signals were broken. Where prices lie, parallel prices appear. Where supply is restricted, access is traded. These markets restored coordination at the margins. They also undermined the state's authority. Each transaction outside the plan weakened belief in the plan. Trust drained away quietly. People stopped assuming that effort would be rewarded. They stopped believing that rules produce results. They learned to navigate around the system rather than through it. This adaptation kept life functioning. It also hollowed out the economy. The official system still existed. It was no longer central. The turning point was not a single decision. It was not a speech or a law. It was the moment money stopped connecting action to outcome. When wages could not reliably buy. When savings could not store value. When prices could not guide choice. At that moment, coordination failed. Power depends on predictability. Once predictability vanished, authority followed. A state can command behavior only if commands translate into results. When factories ignore orders because inputs are missing, commands become theater. When citizens ignore prices because shelves are empty, prices become fiction. The system continued to speak in the language of control. Reality stopped listening. Think about the burden this placed on leadership. Decisions were made with incomplete information. Reports lagged behind events. Failures were hidden until they spread. Each adjustment arrived late. Each fix created new distortions. The system chased symptoms rather than causes. Over time, the gap between intention and outcome widened into a chasm. The economy no longer generated belief. That is the most dangerous condition for any system. Belief does not require prosperity. It requires consistency. When outcomes vary unpredictably, belief collapses. People stop planning long-term. They focus on survival. Short-term thinking replaces investment. Hoarding replaces production. The future shrinks. By the late years, the system was trapped. Full control no longer worked. Partial reform made things worse. Releasing prices threatened stability. Holding them destroyed credibility. Every option carried risk. Delay seemed safest. Delay was fatal. The system had consumed its margin. There was no buffer left. From the outside, the snap would later look sudden. Borders changed. Flags fell. Institutions vanished. From the inside, the snap was long prepared. It was built from mispriced goods, distorted incentives, delayed maintenance, and broken signals. It was built from the refusal to let money speak honestly. The Soviet system did not run out of resources. It ran out of coordination. It did not collapse because people rebelled first. People adapted. They worked around. Collapse did not arrive with a single announcement. It arrived the way winter arrives in a city that no longer heats its buildings properly, quietly at first, then everywhere at once. Stores emptied faster than they could be restocked, not because nothing existed, but because coordination was gone. Goods were produced in the wrong places at the wrong times, in the wrong forms. Factories stalled when inputs failed to arrive. Trains waited for schedules that no longer matched reality. The system that once synchronized millions of actions began to drift out of rhythm. Regions pulled inward. When national coordination weakens, local survival takes priority. Cities try to secure their own supplies. Enterprises hoarded inputs. Officials bent rules to protect their jurisdictions. This was not rebellion. It was adaptation. The center still issued commands, but compliance depended on whether those commands helped people function tomorrow. When they did not, they were ignored. Authority faded not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. The currency unraveled. Official money continued to circulate, but its meaning changed. Prices existed on paper and nowhere else. Wages were paid, but access was uncertain. Savings lost purpose. When money cannot reliably exchange for goods, it stops being a store of value. It becomes a placeholder. People seek alternatives. They trade. They barter. They measure worth in access, not currency. This is not ideology. It is survival. Think about the psychological shock of that transition. A system that promised predictability now offered uncertainty. A society trained to plan around stability was forced to improvise daily. People woke without knowing what would be available or when. Time itself lost structure. Hours were spent searching rather than producing. Energy drained away into queues, negotiations, and workarounds. Productivity collapsed not because people stopped trying, but because effort no longer translated into outcome. The state, once the sole organizer of life, could no longer enforce its own rules. Regulations existed, but enforcement depended on cooperation. Cooperation depended on credibility. Credibility was gone. Officials faced choices they had never been trained to make. Enforce rules that no longer worked, or tolerate violations that kept life going. Many chose the latter. The system functioned only by being ignored. Crowds eventually appeared. Flags did come down. Those images would define the collapse in public memory. But by then, the structure behind those symbols was already hollow. The real collapse happened earlier, in offices, warehouses, and accounts. It happened when the system stopped coordinating reality. The visible end was merely the acknowledgement of a failure long underway. The aftermath was brutal. Savings evaporated as currency lost value. Lifelong accumulations vanished without warning. Supply chains shattered. Links that had taken decades to build broke in months. Specialized factories found themselves without customers or suppliers. A planned world fell into improvisation overnight. People who had never needed to negotiate prices now face markets without rules. Security dissolved into volatility. Think about the generational impact of that shift. Skills that mattered yesterday became useless today. Networks that once guaranteed access disappeared. Trust in institutions collapsed. People learn new lessons quickly. Hoard when you can. Trade favors. Rely on family. The social fabric rewove itself around scarcity and uncertainty. This was not a smooth transition. It was a shock. The collapse revealed something uncomfortable. The system had not failed suddenly. It had been failing quietly for years. The visible breakdown only occurred once buffers were exhausted. Once delays could no longer hide shortages. Once improvisation could no longer compensate for miscoordination. Collapse is rarely a single event. It is a moment when adaptation stops working. The lesson is not that planning always fails or that markets always succeed. That argument is too simple and too comforting. The deeper lesson is about signals. Power built on distorted signals cannot survive forever. When prices are forced to lie, reality does not obey. It waits. It accumulates pressure. Eventually, it breaks through. When money stops reflecting scarcity, resources flow to the wrong